Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to day 2 of our conference as we convene the CHCI session on criminal justice reform, dismantling inequality and the push for social reform. My name is Dennis Gonzalez and I am the Director of Leadership Programs at CHCI since 2018. On behalf of CHCI, I would like to thank Altria and Verizon for their generous support of this exciting session. First, please allow me to introduce our gracious panel host, the Honorable Ayanna Pressley, and our moderator, Mariela Romero. Representative Ayanna Pressley proudly represents Massachusetts' very diverse 7th Congressional District. The daughter of a tenants' rights organizer, she has always been acutely aware of the role that government can play in uplifting families and communities. Since 1992, Representative Pressley has been dedicated activist and community organizer, eventually becoming the first African-American woman to be sworn into Congress from the state of Massachusetts. Today, she is a recognizable face on the front lines of criminal justice reform. She currently serves on the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, where she has remained committed to advocacy and civil rights. In November of 2019, she introduced H.R. 702, the People's Justice Guarantee, a comprehensive people-centered legislation that aims to transform the criminal justice system so that it will one day meet the current unfulfilled promise of justice for all. This panel will bring together notable advocates of criminal justice reform to discuss the impact of mass incarceration and how rehabilitation programs are making positive changes towards social justice. We are honored to have as moderator for this important discussion Mariela Romero, Univision's Regional Director for Community Empowerment. She is also the anchor, writer, and producer of the regional news magazine Conexión Sin Fin de Semana. Mariela has a long record of distinction. This record includes winning 21 Emmy Awards, being the first Latina chosen as a president of the League of Women Voters Gwinnett County, and being named the 2019 recipient of the Olga C. de Goizueta Pacesetter Award. She serves on numerous boards, including the American Heart Association and the Hispanic organization Promoting Education, and recently joined the National Juvenile Defender Center in Washington, D.C. We can't wait to get started. Don't forget to continue the conversation on social media with the hashtag CHCIHHM20. And now, without further ado, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley.
My name is Ayanna Pressley, and I'm the Congresswoman proudly representing the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District. It is an honor to join you for such an important conversation today and to uplift what so many impacted families and organizers have been calling for too long. The dismantling of a mass incarceration system that has ravaged Black and brown communities and separated countless families for generations. And the creation of a criminal legal system that finally centers the dignity and humanity of all people. Today, over 2 million individuals are incarcerated in prisons throughout the country, making the United States the top incarcerator in the world. For Black and brown folks, the true impact and harm of mass incarceration is not abstract. These are our mothers, our fathers, our siblings, our babies. For us, it is deeply personal. Now, like thousands of children in America, I grew up with an incarcerated loved one. My father's trauma and struggle with addiction should have been treated as a medical issue. Instead, he was criminalized and cycled in and out of the criminal legal system for some 14 years of my childhood. In this moment of national reckoning, we must be unapologetic in our calls to dismantle the mass incarceration system by ending the criminalization of substance use, of poverty, of homelessness, and mental illness. We must be intentional and precise as we legislate accountability for police brutality and the violence that has robbed us of the lives of too many Black and brown folks, and instead move in the direction of a more humane, equitable, and just world. I thank you for having this critical conversation today. There are some that are calloused who believe that social problems are in our detention facilities, in our prisons, and in our jails. But these are human beings. individuals who come from families and communities that love them, and the separation of family. It is devastating. And the hurt and the impact of that we feel for generations. So we must move with urgency, with intentionality, continue to organize and to mobilize for that more just and equitable world. And I am so proud to be your partner in that fight.
Thank you, Congresswoman Presley. Good afternoon. My name is Mariela Romero, and I am delighted to be here today. And thank you to CHCI for hosting this powerful leadership conference and deciding to focus attention on this important topic. The land of the free incarcerates more of its citizens than any other country in the world. Even after their sentences have been completed, returning citizens experience profound difficulty securing work and living, preventing them from fully taking part in our society. Black and Brown Americans are also overrepresented in the prison system. According to the Sentencing Project, Latinos are the fastest growing prison population and account for almost 1 in every 3 persons in prison. The overcriminalization of drug use, private prisons, and low-paid or unpaid prison labor is among the most contentious criminal justice issues today. Still, they do not answer the question of why so many Black and Brown people are incarcerated. I am delighted to be joined today by 3 subject matter experts on this topic. First, please welcome Mark Mauer, Senior Advisor at the Sentencing Project. The Atlantic magazine has described him as a scholar who has reframed how Americans view crime, race, and poverty in the public sphere. Next, let's welcome Angela Arboleda from Altra Client Services. Angela previously worked on equality and criminal justice issues affecting diverse communities. Also, we are pleased to have Emilio Gonzalez from Verizon, who serves as the Executive Director of Policy and Strategic Alliances. Emilio was an appointee in the Clinton administration working on internet and technology policy. Welcome, panel, and thank you for joining us. For our audience, I want to tell them that you can submit questions for the panel in the Q&A comments in the chat. Well, I'm going to jump with my first question, and this is for Mark. Mark, drug offenses account for the incarceration of almost 500,000 people. 4 out of 5 people in prison or jail are locked up for something other than a drug offense, either a more severe or even a less severe offense. Many will argue that releasing nonviolent drug offenders will end mass incarceration, but it's not as simple as that, correct?
That's right. It's critically important first that we do something about the excessive incarceration of people for a drug offense. The drug war has been a failure from day one. It has very little impact on the availability or cost of drugs, and it really robs resources from prevention, treatment issues. But to say that that alone will end mass incarceration, unfortunately, is not correct. You know, we lock up more people than any other nation, basically for 2 reasons. We send people to prison in greater numbers, and we keep them there for longer periods of time. So it's really a punishment system overall where we are in excess of what many other nations do. At the extremes, if we look at people serving life sentences in prison, 1 of every 7 people incarcerated today is serving a life prison sentence. So we just need to restore more balance and reduce the amount of punishment that is taking place across the board.
And to the point that Mark is making, Angela, Are there unintended consequences of law enforcement policing behaviors such as jaywalking, sitting on a sidewalk, or even selling cigarettes that particularly in the current protest environment where the movement against criminalization is so strong, do you think uh, those over-criminalization tactics have been contributed to this problem?
I think that's right. There are certainly unintended consequences for the overcriminalization of nonviolent offenses. And some of these offenses are silly. And as Mark mentioned, they contribute and add up to the mass numbers of people incarcerated. So we're talking about, jaywalking and minor infractions, and also tobacco-related offenses. We see, unfortunately, that more and more people are being stopped and harassed and come into contact with law enforcement because they're violating some tobacco or prohibitions. Say, for example, smoking in public housing or smoking in a bus stop. And so we believe that um, instead of having this over criminalization of nonviolent offenses like tobacco offenses be present in everyday life, we need to be able to divert some of these resources to more education. And when people have substance abuse issues, we should definitely do something about prevention and intervention instead of incarceration.
Um, Emilio, I'm going to go to you now because, the various government agencies involved in the justice system collect a lot of critical data. And I want to know if, in your opinion, this data is helping policymakers or even the public understand this issue.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the CHCI for bringing us together on what I think is a very timely and important conversation. And as to the question of data, it's all in how it's used, manipulated, shared, and synthesized. I think data points are critically important. The work that Mark does, for example, with the Sentencing Project, relies heavily on data. You have to look backwards in order to understand how to look forward. So I think so, but I think also it's important to discuss, who has access to the data, under what conditions, and for what purposes, because there's a lot of privacy concerns. So, for example, as an employer, we ban the box, which is we do not ask if you've been convicted of a crime as part of the initial intake into the application process. There are a lot of other practices that can be brought to bear and a lot to learn in this space. So it's a really good question, Mariana. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilio. Now, Mark, Angela was mentioning mental health. Let's talk about the role of mental health experts in this arena. The public in general does not know that people convicted of violent and sexual offenses are among the least likely to be rearrested. And age actually is one of the main predictors of violence since it peaks in adolescence and then it declines with age. Why don't we have a more active role for the mental health experts in the justice criminal system?
Well, we certainly need that. And, one of the conversations going on right now in terms of reform to our law enforcement agencies around the country, very critical conversations trying to reframe the role of law enforcement. A significant numbers of calls for service that come to law enforcement have really underlying problems of mental health issues. And the challenge is we take law enforcement officers who have far less training in dealing with mental health issues than the professional social workers and others who know how to do that best. And far too often, as we've seen, we get these tragic situations where law enforcement officers end up using their guns and killing people at times for what starts off really as a disturbed individual. So there are some jurisdictions that are either sending out a mental health professional along with a law enforcement officer, or in some cases, if the dispatcher decides it's a mental health issue, not a criminal justice issue, just sending out the mental health professional. So we have choices we can make that not only can defuse the situation, but really take law enforcement out of the picture to let them focus on things they do well and appropriately, and shift our resources so that we don't see problems that are already there escalating because of the presence of law enforcement being there.
And let me ask you, continue with you, Mark. What is the role of mental health experts already with the population that is incarcerated? Is there something that can be done more to assist that population in jail already?
Well, there needs to be a lot more. I hear practitioners in the justice system all the time. These are often lawyers or corrections officials. And, a defense attorney will say, there's something wrong with this guy I'm defending. I don't know what it is, but he's got some kind of mental health problem. So they sort of have a gut feeling that there's something going on, but clearly they don't have the training to deal with this. As we look at people going to the prison system, the level of treatment available is just minuscule compared to the scale of the problem. So here we are taking people who already have mental health challenges, putting them in probably the worst situation one can imagine, putting them in cages, which is what our prison system is essentially. The keeping them away from their community supports, being in a very stressful environment, that's challenging for someone who isn't suffering from mental health problems, much worse for someone who is. So what we want to be doing is to identify and divert people from the justice system as often and as appropriately as possible, to the extent that people may present a threat to the community, decide what kind of institution that is separate from the community but doesn't necessarily look like a maximum security prison is an appropriate way to do it, while we provide the treatment that should enable the person to be coming home to the community at a reasonable period of time.
Thank you, Mark. Now I'm going to move to you, Angela, and to you, Emilio, because I want to know, how did Altria uh, came to be involved with criminal and social justice issues? And I also want to know about the initiatives that you are working on that address this issue.
Well, thank you for that question, Mariela. I think that a lot of people may not know the history of Altria, but Altria is not only a company that produces tobacco and wine products, but also that has deep commitment to social and criminal justice. And this is not new. This stems back from the 30s. My company is, over 150 years old. And back in the 30s, it was one of the first companies to desegregate the workforce in Virginia. We were also instrumental in putting together a green book, not the green book, but a version of the green book for people who were traveling north and south and needed a place to stay where they would be safe. And so we've had many, many initiatives over the years that have really informed the company about our commitment to criminal and social issues. And now today, in the backdrop of the deaths of Black Americans, the death of George Floyd, we heard a very strong cry from our employees, our customers, our trade partners. And they said to us, we need to stand and do the right thing again, and we need to be vocal and weigh in on the issues of today of police over policing and police enforcement in communities of color in particular. So as a result of that, we have instituted initiatives that are public policy education that really talk about the over-criminalization of tobacco offenses, not only at the national level, but at the state and local level. We have created a set of principles that are available and that we have been sharing with legislators that really talk about the importance of police reform and drug reform in order to bring some equality into the criminal justice system. And lastly, we have a large commitment, a $5 million commitment to the issue of criminal justice and Black-owned businesses. We believe that addressing these two issues will bring some semblance of equality and justice to the African American community. So we are standing, as we have over the past century, with our Black and Brown brothers and sisters in this very hard moment where we see over-policing and the overuse of force.
Emilio, and it's basically the same question. You just mentioned that you have some policies at Verizon that, help people with a criminal background be able to enter the workforce. And I want to know more about what is the interest of Verizon in this arena? Is it more on the criminal justice side? Is it reforming policing? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so the short answer, it's more on the criminal justice reform movement. We're not new to the world of civil rights and advocacy. We've been an early and vocal supporter of comprehensive immigration reform, strong defender of the deferred action for childhood arrivals. And as a result of being involved in these spaces, we caught a little luck on this one. So the NAACP came to us several years ago and brought to our attention the petition of a grandmother who was asking the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to take a look into the rates that were being paid for prison payphones to keep families connected with loved ones. We're not in that business, but we certainly know the business. And we were the only ISP or internet service provider to weigh in on the matter in support of the petitioner because we recognized there was a market failure there and we thought the government should take action to help families stay connected with loved ones. That opened the door to a lot of conversations internally and with partners about what else could we do to bring our name and our resources to the criminal justice front. And what we've done, and we can talk more about it later, is we're building a holistic approach to this, which leverages our attorneys and law firms to do pro bono work on a number of areas. We're also involved in outreach and education and using our media platforms for that. So for example, October 28th, we will be hosting a broadcast with addressing the issue of women incarcerated and what can be done there. And finally, we are putting our money where our mouth is and not just writing a check, but rather we're putting our name to do advocacy at the state level, which is critical because that's where most individuals are incarcerated. Only about 5 or 6% are in federal prisons. And we're also putting our advocacy behind things like the First Step Act, the Second Chance Act, and most recently, early release as a result of COVID-19 for nonviolent offenders who have served more than half their sentence. So we're trying to come at this from a holistic point of view. It's a complex issue. And to be honest, we have to do it humbly because it's kind of a new area for us.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, Mark, I want to go to the topic of private prisons. Even though the industry has lobbied to maintain high levels of incarceration, less than 9% of all incarcerated people are held in private prisons. Do you think we should focus the discussion on ending the privatization of prison services like phone calls, like just Emilio mentioned, medical care, etc., that really unload the cost of incarceration to the incarcerated people and also to their families?
Well, I think there are several ways to think about the issues of privatization in prisons. As Amelia points out, the issue of prison phone calls has really just been horrendous in terms of putting roadblocks in front of families who are often low income themselves and their loved ones who are in prison, and family members are forced to make terrible choices about whether to accept a very expensive phone call, collect phone call from the loved one in prison, or buy more milk for their kids. It's literally like that. There may be a role for certain services in prison, medical care and food services. Government frequently contracts with private vendors, so that in itself is not necessarily inappropriate. The question is really what kind of oversight there is over it and whose profits and who may be harmed from it. The bigger question is those private companies that operate prisons themselves. And here, I find it very disturbing that we're taking a function of government, a function of the whole community, and to determine questions of personal liberty and turn that over to a profit-making entity. And so it just puts the incentives in all the wrong places. It also exacerbates some of the existing problems we see in incarceration. For example, private prison companies may build a prison anywhere in the country, in any state. They don't particularly care where the prisoners come from. They just want to fill the beds. So we have a situation whereby a private prison in the state of Arizona for years now has had hundreds of prisoners from Hawaii incarcerated there because Hawaii had a shortage of beds. They contracted with a private vendor in Arizona, and so they fly over their prisoners there. Well, what does that mean? It means that those people are rarely going to get a visit from their families. If any of them have legal appeals pending, they're rarely going to have a chance to meet with their attorney. It just makes it much more difficult for their planning to come back into the community. So we have both profit incentives built into it, and we have just more remoteness, if you want to think of it that way. So I think private prisons are a significant problem we see, but as you point out, ending private prisonization will not end mass incarceration, but it's one step along the way of getting to that point.
Mark, do you think what is the problem of immigration in the detention centers where immigrants are being detained? Can you give us paint us a picture of how problematic that is, and how does that combine with the overall picture of the state prisons and the federal prisons that are in the United States? Why people cannot differentiate the offenses of someone who just crossed the border illegally to some of the other offenses in many people who just have a condition of being here illegally are considered criminals by the public in general? How can we change that narrative?
Yeah. Well, as we know, as you pointed out, in the public prisons through the criminal justice system, fewer than 9% of individuals locked up are incarcerated in a private institution, but with immigration detention, the figure's approaching half or so. So it's been a very lucrative industry for those companies who are operating those institutions. It's also a situation where these are political choices that are being made about how to handle people who are in this country violating certain laws, who are undocumented. Different political administrations, different nations have taken different approaches over time about whether these should be criminalized, whether these should be treated as civil offenses, of course, whether you should separate families and their children's, and just the other horrors that we've seen in recent years through the immigration policies that have been adopted. And these are choices that are made that could be unmade in very short order if there's a political will to do so. It also, of course, gets at the much bigger problem of we're talking about issues of labor, we're talking about family reunification, we're talking about development of economies on both sides of the border, wherever that may be. So these are larger issues, and unfortunately, far too many policymakers have chosen to not deal with these fundamental problems that are pushing this situation, and it becomes a war of sound bites and political rhetoric, which done great disservice clearly to millions of people caught up in these systems.
Correct. You're correct. Angela, I'm going to go with you. In your opinion, what are the lessons from the war on drugs from the 80s and the 90s? And what lessons can we take from that to instruct legislators today that really want to end mass incarceration in the United States?
Yes, this is a great question, and I think Mark brought it up at the beginning of this conversation. We have the advantage of knowing or remembering our history of what happened in the 80s and 90s, which was what was perhaps well-intentioned policies that really, when implemented, really unraveled the mass incarceration that we see today. In the 80s and 90s, low-level nonviolent offenders, a lot of them were caught for using marijuana, and they were given mandatory minimums that were far too harsh. And some of these people are still in prison. So today, we need to be smart about our approaches. We need to learn and heed those lessons. So instead of implementing what seems like well-intentioned policies, like the blanket prohibition of menthol cigarettes, which is well-intentioned because it talks about making sure that people stop smoking for health reasons, making sure that youth don't smoke, which we're really proud to have supported the legal age of 21, raising the legal age to 21. But really, if we don't understand the past, we're going to make the same exact errors, which is we're going to over-criminalize the use of certain substances, whether it's marijuana in the 80s and 90s, or whether it is flavored tobacco today. And so instead, what my company is doing and thinking is taking a very smart and innovative approach to this problem. What we're saying is nicotine is addictive, but nicotine does not kill you. What kills you is the tar in the tobacco. So what are some of the science-based innovations out there that can address the issue of nicotine addiction and use this innovation to curb people's addiction? And we have today, through our tobacco harm reduction portfolio, great examples of products that can actually do that. For example, there is a product that heats and doesn't burn the tobacco. There is other products that you can put in your mouth and you're not ingesting tar. And so it's making sure that we are smart and that we're not over criminalizing people's behaviors, but instead that we're opening doors to alternatives to incarceration, alternatives to smoking, just like we have alternatives when we have methadone, or when we talk about sex education. We need to have alternatives for people who are addicted to tobacco smoking.
Emilio, like Angela was explaining, her industry is proposing alternatives. What is the role of corporate America in the discussion in really creating effective change in changing the criminal justice apparatus in the United States?
I'll tread lightly here because I'm not a scholar on these matters. That's why we have Mark with us today. Look, I think perspective is important here. And I think if we step back and look at the fact that there are more prisons in this country than there are colleges and universities, it starts to lead me down the path of thinking how to break the cycle from incarceration to back to society, but then so many have to return. And I think that's where companies as employers, as taxpayers, as a required voice, I think, in our society to take a stand on certain things, I think there are thoughtful, effective strategies that can be brought to bear. So, for example, in certain states, there are movements to provide skills and training to individuals who are nonviolent offenders. And if they receive their accreditation and complete the coursework, they would receive time off towards their sentence. They come out and they now have a skill, and it could be something in coding or how to be a customer service rep, or some of the basics to help them get a pathway back into society and break the cycle. And I think we're looking at that kind of state legislation and encouraging, when appropriate, leaders to think about how public and private can come together to provide opportunities while incarcerated that then translate themselves into the difficult transition back to normal life, if you would. We could discuss this subject for a while, but as I said at the onset, I'm not a scholar on this, and welcome other ideas and suggestions.
Taking what Emilio said, Mark, what would be your idea for corporate America, for the public, to really, make policy changes effective? Do you think corporate America needs to lobby more in this subject, or the public itself needs to express better during the elections? In your opinion, what would be the thing that would make change possible?
Well, I think if we think of corporate America, what it can do, clearly employment is a very significant issue. And in this regard, there are just enormous barriers to employment for people with a felony record. In every state, there are scores of policies and restrictions on employment for people with a record. Now, some of these are based on the crime that a person may have committed if it's relevant to the job position. So, for example, if someone gets out of prison and applies for a job as an accountant in a company and turns out that she has a conviction for embezzlement, it doesn't mean she doesn't get the job, but you would want to legitimately consider where the relationship is to that job and whether that's a problem. On the other hand, there are many states where you can't get a license to be a barber if you have a felony conviction. Now, I don't know where that comes from. Originally, it goes back a long time, but surely it can't be that you get to hold a blade in your hand, because there's no shortage of ways to get a blade in your hand if that's really what you want to do. So we can all use support in getting rid of these very antiquated policies, which in the vast majority of cases don't tell the employer anything about the person's suitability for employment. There are reasonable and growing number of employers who are now welcoming opening up opportunities for people coming home from prison to gain useful employment. And it would be very good if we can see the word spread about that, if employers can speak out about how and why they chose to go this route. It doesn't mean that every person coming out of prison is going to be your number one employee, but that's true in people off the street as well. So there's no shortage of people in prison. When I go and talk to them, they very much have the motivation. They don't want to come back to prison. They want to do something productive, and yet they come out of prison, and we as society have so many doors shut against them being able to succeed. It just increases the likelihood that they will return to prison, and that doesn't help them, and certainly doesn't help us as a community of people either.
Thank you. And we are now starting to get a lot of questions from the audience. Thank you so much. This question from Jessica, she says, COVID-19 has severely impacted prison population. What are the prisons required to do to protect inmates? And what federal agencies oversees prison compliance? I think, Mark, you are the expert.
Start off with that. Well, there's very few requirements for what prison systems must do during this crisis. Now, some prison systems have stepped up and are trying to use public health guidance to the best of their ability, but when you think about prisons as institutions, they violate everything we know about best practices in the COVID crisis, particularly the overcrowding, the failure to keep social distancing within prisons. Often we see limits on the protective equipment that's available. This is just one more very fundamental ripple effect of mass incarceration. And we have such bloated systems now, even for a dedicated corrections official, it makes it very difficult. Some of the more enlightened states and local jurisdictions have stepped up efforts to get people out of the institutions as much as possible. For example, in some states, if you're within 6 or 12 months of the end of your sentence, they've been releasing those people to go home with the understanding that additional 6 months in prison is not going to change your life dramatically. So why do we get you out of harm's way and do something like that? In local jails, people are stuck there because of inability to pay bail in many cases. Money shouldn't be a hindrance to public safety concerns. So there are some measures being taken. Unfortunately, they're still relatively modest given the scale of the problem. But again, it just points out that mass incarceration makes all of our existing social and public health problems that much worse in a crisis like this.
I have another question, and maybe, I don't know if Angela also wants to comment on this. If marijuana becomes legal on a federal level, how do we ensure the swift release of folks who were incarcerated from those crimes? Is there a way to go back? Mm-hmm.
Yes, there are efforts at the federal level, but also at the state level, to make sure that there is a rationale to make sure that people who were arrested in the past for low-level marijuana offenses are released because of time served, and there is some kind of panel that reviews the sentence and the time that they have served versus the time that they're still serving, to make sure that the new laws and the new policies, as much as possible, comport with the new standards and the new thinking about marijuana and its overall implication in society. So that is definitely one of the things that that I know that people in Congress are looking to making sure that we don't leave people who are sitting in prison for low-level marijuana offenses, that we don't leave them behind, because really they were victims of that time of that time's thinking and rationale. And as we have evolved and understood things, we need to make sure that those sentences are also that they comport with the new policies. So let me turn it over to Mark to see if he has anything to add there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think Angela is certainly correct about all that. And, but it's important to note that when Congress or a state legislature passes a law changing sentencing policy, or in this case, legalization issues, it's not generally retroactive unless they specifically make it that way. And there's been, very serious problems in recent years with the failure to do that. So for people who support de-escalating, arrests and prosecutions of marijuana offenses, it's important to keep in mind that if this changes, if you believe this is a good way to go, we shouldn't be punishing people for a different kind of thinking 10 or 20 years ago, but make sure that changes are made retroactively in this area too.
Thank you. And Mark, I have another question for you from Kim. What can be done about excessive prison time, such as 50, 100 years for nonviolent crimes, who, and for people who were caught up in the three strikes and you're out policy?
Well, it requires change in the laws, and it requires public pressure to get policymakers to make those changes. We had example in California in 1995, the voters approved a three strikes and you're out policy, whereupon your first two strikes had to be serious or violent offenses. Your third strike could be any felony offense in California. The policy was challenged in the US Supreme Court in 2003. One of the plaintiffs was serving three strikes for stealing three golf clubs from a sporting goods store. The other one had stole $153 worth of videotapes from a Kmart store. And the question was, did this represent cruel and unusual punishment? The Supreme Court, in all its wisdom, ruled against the plaintiffs and said, well, this is what the legislature in California believes is necessary. We're not going to overrule their judgment. So the golf club thief had a sentence of 25 to life, and the videotape thief a sentence of 50 to life. That's what these policies have brought us. Now, finally, when there was sufficient public attention to this in 2014, there was another ballot issue in California, said that now your third strike also had to be a serious or violent offense, and that was approved so that we won't have these kinds of sentences for low-level offenses in the future. But mandatory policies like this, even for serious offenses, fail to give the judge the ability to take into account individual circumstances. So did the person have mental health issues? Was the person under the influence of substance abuse while this was happening? Was there a pattern of terrible upbringing and abuse in the home as a child? None of which would excuse the crime, but it would help a judge to understand Incorporated. So we need to put pressure on our policymakers to say, one size doesn't fit all when it comes to criminal justice. We need to have some rational thought and analysis brought back into the system.
You are correct. And hopefully we have a lot of policymakers watching this discussion today.
Mm-hmm.
Emilio, this is something that I think you could answer. To what extent does changing technology affects how reform occurs? Can artificial intelligence be effectively used in prediction of crime, and how do we ensure it is not biased? I know it's a very futuristic question, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it's actually not that futuristic given all the advances in AI, facial recognition, and other types of technologies. But I think that the complex question here is that there are a lot of concerns among civil rights and minority leaders about particularly the use of facial and the use of algorithms for predicting outcomes, say, in crime. Unless you understand the algorithm, you don't understand the biases. So in other words, you have to know what goes in to know what comes out, because there could be coding that indicates factors or variables for a particular skin color should have a certain weight, for example. So I think these kind of predictive systems are not ready for prime time because of some of the algorithmic challenges that exist. But look, I think there are also some very basic, simple things that are essential. So if you've been away for 20, 30 years and you hand someone an iPhone, I'm not sure they know what to do with it. So there could be a role for society and nonprofits and corporations to help with training and opportunities about how to use some of these new technologies. And If you're looking for a job, the do's and don'ts on social media, because that's now a place where all employers go to look to see kind of what you do on your time off. So there's also the fact of connectivity. If you come out and you don't have an address or a phone, what do you tell a potential employer? So, those are things we're going to look at too. We're not claiming we have these answers, but we are committed to taking a good hard look and working with industry and others to see. Again, all this requires public-private partnerships. I don't think any one pillar can do it alone. So, but I think technology offers a lot of opportunity here. We just got to make sure it gets into their hands and it's appropriately used. And on the predictive stuff, if we have this discussion next year, we'll probably be in a much better place to take a longer, deeper look at just how effective or troublesome these technologies can be.
Thank you. Thank you. Marina asks, how would you define prison abolition, and how is the current social movement impacting how we address mass incarceration? Mark?
Well, prison abolition is being frequently discussed these days, and it's sort of ironic in some ways. Here we are, a country with more than 2 million people behind bars to think about abolition. I think one way to think about it is think of other campaigns for abolition. 100 and 200 years ago, the campaign to abolish slavery, for example. To many people, that would have seemed like a pipe dream 200 years ago to imagine that we could abolish slavery in this country. And yet, of course, through a lot of struggle and hard work, that did eventually come about. So we're not going to abolish incarceration tomorrow by any means, but I think all of us should hope that we could live in a society that doesn't require us to put human beings in cages in the name of public safety. So if we think that is a place we'd like to get to, maybe not for 100 years, what steps do we need to begin to take to at least inch forward towards that kind of an outcome? How do we reimagine public safety, as people are talking about now? How do we think about different ways to create opportunity? What can we do to restructure our social and economic relations to reduce the outcomes of people committing crime and then being punished without being rehabilitated? So as a goal, as a vision, I am wholeheartedly support of prison abolition. All it does is tell us that we need to begin today to little by little work towards that end goal, and we'll be delighted if it comes in less than 100 years, but that's the direction we want to be moving.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And this is all the time we have for the questions from the audience. And I want to thank the audience for great questions. But I also want to give all of you some time to leave our audience with some thoughts about this. Personal, from your background. I just want the audience to get more of why this is personal to you. So let's start with you, Angela.
Well, the issue of criminal and juvenile justice is very personal to me. I started my career 20 years ago working for Unidos US back then, and CLR. And Mark was one of the first people who shared his knowledge with me 20 years ago. I wrote a book about the importance of really shedding light about the reality of Latinos in the criminal justice system. And so this is a very personal issue for me. I have come full circle within my career, and now I am in corporate America, and I see the importance that corporate America can play and is playing when addressing social issues and social movements. And so I talked about this earlier, how even though Altra is not a newcomer to social issues, we are newcomers to this specific point in time of police overuse of force. And we decided to be bold And although we're not experts on criminal justice issues, we want to make sure that that we lend our voice and that we tell the stories of our employees who are African Americans and other people of color, and their feeling of desperation about what's happening today. So I'm excited to be a part of criminal justice reform within a mass corporation like Altria. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Emilio, your thoughts, your final thoughts.
I would just say I have a belief system that believes redemption is critical in everyone's life, and that means an opportunity. I know as a first generation immigrant who came here with his mom, I had those opportunities. I've had those second chances, and I think everyone should be afforded that. I'm also really encouraged that for the first time in a long time, I'm seeing both sides of the aisle talk about this issue, address this issue. I think it was nice to see the First Step Act have such bipartisan support. And at a time of such division and polarization, I hope maybe this is one issue where as a society we can have a great conversation and find some solutions. It's the right thing to do. And I do think companies have a role to play, as Mark said, as employers, but also as stakeholders in the future of the country and the workforce. So thank you, Mariela, for bringing us together on this again. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Emilio. And we're going to conclude with you, Mark.
Sure. Well, one thing I've noticed over many years, I've spent, quite a bit of time visiting in prisons and talking to a wide range of individuals in there. And, when we talk in general about the people in prison, we tend to describe them by the crime that they've been convicted of. So he's a robber, she's a burglar, he's a drug seller, he's a murderer, things like that. And none of that describes who those people are any more than if you said something, one term about me, that a disease I might have or something else. And what you find, I think, when you go in prison shouldn't be surprising at all, because it's true of all of us that we're all complex human beings. We have things we're proud of and things we're embarrassed about. And we've had good role models in our lives and bad role models too. And that's what people in prison are grappling with too. And I think if we really want to change their prospects, change our prospect for public safety, we need to recognize that these are human beings who've made mistakes. We've all made mistakes, and their mistakes in many cases are very severe, but it doesn't mean they can't change. It doesn't mean that we can't create opportunities to help that change. And if we can take an approach like that, then we get away from the stereotypes, we get away from the demonization, and we start to look more like a problem-solving community. And I think if we do that, we all benefit from those kinds of changes.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I have a tough job because I have to follow all of you with my final thoughts. And what I would say, my sister is an anthropologist, and I always heard stories from her about different tribes around the world and primitive societies, etc. And she was telling me the story of a primitive society where every time someone is born, the whole village comes and they make a song together for that baby. And everybody learns the song for each person. So when someone does something wrong to that tribe, to that society, what the village does, they come together and they sing that song to that person to remind him or her of who they are, and also to remind them as a society that that is a child, that was a child, as a human being. Kind of like Mark was saying, we have to remember, we have to have compassion. We are all human beings. So those are my final thoughts. I think if we learn from societies that we believe are primitive, maybe they have some of the answers that as a modern society we have forgotten. So with that, I want to thank you all for your thoughts, for your expertise, for your time. And I also want to encourage all of the participants to continue tweeting and sharing using the hashtag CHCIHHM20. We encourage all of you to continue to attend all of the sessions of the rest of the day. And if you're interested, you should register also at the chcihhm.live. The celebration of our gala is going to be happening Monday, September 21st from 6 to 8 p.m. And once you register for the conference, you will also be registered for the gala. With that, I close this session. Thank you again.